In last week's Buy Low video, we talked about trading for players like Brian Robinson Jr., Jahmyr Gibbs, DK Metcalf, T. Higgins, James Conner. If you had those players on your roster in week 7, would you have won your matchup? I don't know. You tell me. If you had watched last week's video, would you have won your matchup? I don't know. You tell me. So as we approach week 8, let's break down 8 players that I think you guys need to go buy low on right now before they pop off in week 8 of 2024 fantasy football. And before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 8 NFL pick'ems are already live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL pick'em to use towards Sunday's slate of games. And on top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free pick'em to use towards Sunday's action, and up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you sign up on Underdog with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. All right, let's kick the video off with James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. A down performance in week 7 with 9.2 fantasy points, 12 touches, 32 rushing yards. His worst mark on the season in terms of yards per carry at 2.67 and 1 touchdown. So that still resulted in 9.2 fantasy points. Wasn't awful, maybe got you through the week, but certainly wasn't good. So I think for those who own James Cook, this is a nice opportunity to go out and target them and try and buy low, because we have 2 other factors here. There's this weird thing that happens, right? James Cook missed week 6, okay? Then he had kind of a down performance against a good Titans run defense in week 7. But that combination there helps when you're going to try and trade for a player. And on top of that, we got Ray Davis kind of in the mix here. He had just 5 touches in week 7, but he turned that into 41 rushing yards, 8.2 yards per carry, a touchdown. He added a catch for 6 receiving yards. But for me, like, that's not enough involvement out of the RB2 to be overly concerned. Like, Ray Davis is good. We like Davis going in the season. There's going to be times where he helps spell James Cook, and we've seen what Ray Davis can do if he fills in as the RB1 with Cook missing time. I mean, 18.2 fantasy points in week 6. But ultimately, I still think James Cook is the RB1 here. Now, of course, we always have the threat of Josh Allen vulturing touchdowns. But when we take a step back here, James Cook still has 15.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He's a top 15 running back in fantasy football. A great matchup this week against the Seattle Seahawks, allowing the 25th most fantasy points per game. A great matchup in week 9 against the Miami Dolphins, a bottom 3 run defense in fantasy football. A very good matchup in week 10 against the Indianapolis Colts, before a tough matchup against the Chiefs in week 11. But ultimately, Cook is in a great overall spot for the next couple weeks. Should have a great outing and a good game script against the Seahawks in week 8. I think there's enough here that you guys can potentially go out and buy low on James Cook. So if that window is open in your league, make sure you are trying to trade for James Cook now. All right, first wide receiver is going to be DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. Got a little banged up in week 6, but was able to return and play, but had a down game, right? 5 targets, 4 receptions, 20 receiving yards. His first single-digit fantasy performance of the season with just 6 fantasy points. Then he had the bye week in week 7, and I always talk about this. Always try to trade for players who are on bye or are coming off of their bye week, especially if they had a down week the week before the bye. There's just this weird, like, psychological effect on the owner of that player when they're coming out of their bye. Like, they feel their perceived value is a little bit lower because they didn't start in a fantasy lineup the week before. So I think DJ Moore is in a good spot to go out and try and trade for him right now. And he's still been fantastic on the season, averaging 13.5 fantasy points per game, double digits every week except for week 6. And don't forget, this Bears offense got off to a slow start, but they've really started to come into their own in the past couple weeks, and they've got a good matchup against the Commanders this week, especially for the wide receiver position. I mean, Dan Quinn's got this defense playing well, but I mean, they played the Panthers and the Browns in the past 2 weeks, so Trust me, I like the Commanders' defense right now. They've looked better, but this is still a unit that has at least struggled against the wide receiver position and still hasn't been great overall on the season. And this game could get a little wacky. Jaden Daniels may not even play here in Week 8, so this is a good spot for DJ Moore. Coming out of the bye week, they're going to get their wide receiver 1 involved right off the bat, so he should smash this week. Buy low while you can. He's got a couple good matchups coming up here. I mean, the Cardinals, the Patriots, the Packers, the Vikings, the Lions, then the Niners, the Vikings, the Lions, the Seahawks. I mean, it's a pretty strong schedule the rest of the way for DJ Moore. And the way that division looks, I mean, we might see the Bears seriously fighting for a wild card playoff spot this year. So it could be a lot of competitive game scripts as well. So I don't know how long this buy low window on DJ Moore might be available, but as long as it is, go ahead and buy DJ Moore. He is a great buy low option here in Week 8. Next up is David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions. Now, this one might be a little bit harder to swing because Monty has still been fantastic on the season, sitting as the RB10 currently in fantasy football. And it's kind of funny because in last week's video, we had the opposite thing going on with, I mean, not everyone in the fantasy community, but some people in the fantasy community freaking out about Jahmyr Gibbs coming off of a 12-point performance against the Dallas Cowboys. And we talked about Jahmyr Gibbs as a good buy low last week if that window was open in your league. And now we have the opposite thing happening. I mean, Gibbs had 33 or 32 fantasy points this past week. Monty had 8. And the week before, Gibbs had 12 and Monty had 21. So, you know, this past week, Monty has the fumble. It almost leads to a loss for the Lions, but it did not. And just overall, just not a great game against a tough Minnesota run defense. 9 touches, 31 yards on the ground, 3 catches, 39 receiving yards, 8 fantasy points. He gets another steep matchup here against the Tennessee Titans, giving up the 13th fewest fantasy points in Week 8. But, I mean, Monty is just one of these running backs. I don't really care about the matchup. I know last week was not good, but Monty's a running back that you can start every single week. I mean, he's averaging 16.4 fantasy points per game, still a top 10 running back in fantasy football, and he's got a pretty nice stretch for the most part in the coming weeks as we get into the midpoint of the season here. After this week, he gets the Packers and the Texans. Those are a little bit tougher, you know, overall matchups, but they're both road games, but they should be good competitive game scripts. And Monty's just one of these running backs, like, it's one of the best offenses in the league, and when they're in the red zone, they're probably going to utilize Monty, right? But then after that, the Jaguars, the Colts, the Bears, Packers again, but then the Bills, the Bears, and the Niners. I mean, overall, even if we don't have the best matchups here, and while we do have a lot of really good matchups sprinkled in there, we have good game scripts overall. And the Lions could seriously be fighting for the number 1 overall seed in the NFC. So if there's any buy low window on David Montgomery in your league, go out and trade for him while you still can. Next up is Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens, who has made the buy low video previously earlier in the season, right before he went on that stretch of having 19 fantasy points in Week 5 and 22.4 in Week 6. Then he had a down week in Week 7 against the Bucs, just 4 fantasy points, 1 target, 1 catch, 11 receiving yards. Not good. But he got that ankle rolled up on, and he really probably shouldn't have played. He was really just a decoy out there and didn't even see another target after that catch that led to the ankle injury. And at this point in the week, he hasn't practiced either, so he might not play in Week 8. But if he does play in Week 8, even if he's hurt, I mean, he's in position for a good game because this Cleveland Browns secondary is just bad. This Cleveland Browns defense, just not good. This team just uninspired. Maybe Jameis Winston changes things here with Deshaun Watson out for the season. And I mean, their run defense is okay, don't get me wrong, but are we really going to be worried about that against the Ravens? I don't think so. So we'll see if Flowers plays or doesn't play this week. And then it's a bad matchup in Week 9 against the Denver Broncos and Pat Surtain, right? But overall, once again, great offense here. There's definitely going to be a buy low window here between the ankle injury, the matchup in Week 9 against the Broncos, and ultimately we're going to have the Ravens in plenty of either competitive game scripts or games where they're just piling it on against their opponents. One of, if not the best offense in the league here in the Ravens. So we want pieces of this offense as the season progresses. Zay Flowers is still the wide receiver 1 on this team. I know they can get it done with Lamar. I know they can get it done with Henry. I know Mark Andrews is finally coming back, and Bateman, we have talked about on the channel before this past week, starting to come through as well. but Zay Flowers is still going to be a huge part of this offense. So take advantage of this buy low window. Get him on your roster as we approach week 8. Next up is Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers. Coming off a game where he had 11.2 fantasy points. That is his lowest mark since week 2 of the season, and easily his lowest mark of the season since Andy Dalton has been the starting quarterback. Now, Andy Dalton is not going to be the starting quarterback this week while he has a sprained thumb. So that means Bryce Young is going to start. And they're going up against the Denver Broncos. So I don't really like Chuba Hubbard this week, although if there's any offensive player on this team that I'm going to start, it is Chuba Hubbard, right? But, I mean, this Broncos unit 11th against the running back position. Bryce Young, I feel a little shaky here, but the point being, this helps the buy low window, right? Because the other aspect here is we have Jonathan Brooks at some point in the season going to return. He's been practicing in a limited capacity, or I shouldn't say return, going to make his actual, NFL debut, right? But we've got some good matchups coming up for the Carolina Panthers, and I think even when Jonathan Brooks comes into action here, that Chuba Hubbard's still going to see plenty of touches. So I think you've got some panic around this offense for good reason. Even if Dalton was the starter, they looked really bad in week 7. And then now we got Bryce Young starting this week. It's a bad matchup. But Chuba Hubbard is still going to be a player that we can spot play, even if Brooks is back throughout the season. He's still going to get enough value touches in this offense, is my belief. So especially if Chuba Hubbard has a bad outing in week 8, Bryce Young is awful. You want to wait till after week 8. The Panthers play the Saints in week 9. It is a smash matchup there. So even if you want to take a look at waiting until this week is over and then trading for him, I think Chuba Hubbard is a great buy low candidate as we approach the week. All right, next up is Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers, who, missed week 7 against the Chiefs, tried to play, had pneumonia, fluid in his lungs, ended up in the hospital, but he's back with the team. He hasn't been practicing, so his status is still up in the air for week 8 against the Dallas Cowboys. This feels like one of those games that Deebo, if he plays, will pop off. Deebo has some inconsistency, right? But when he pops, he pops. And now we got Brandon Ayuk out for the entire season. I know Kittle's been heavily involved for the most part outside of the past 2 games. Jordan Mason, the run game has looked good. We might get Christian McCaffrey back. But we also got Jawan Jennings dealing with a hip injury. I mean, he hasn't been practicing this week either at the time I'm recording this, so we're going to be looking at guys like Ricky Pearsall, Jacob Cowing to step up. Deebo should be in line for plenty of overall volume once he is fully healthy, and I've seen a lot of panic around Deebo. People are acting like Deebo had his leg amputated or something, so there should be a pretty good buy low window here, whether Deebo misses week 8 or he plays. But the point being is he definitely has a shot to play this week. He's averaging 11.8 fantasy points per game on the season. For the most part, he's been very good. He had the down week in week 5 against Arizona that unfortunately you probably started him this past week if you owned him, and just out of our control. But outside of that, 10 or more fantasy points in every game with a ceiling of 20.7 fantasy points. So Deebo, going to be a player who's in line for a lot of volume, still brings a high ceiling, is a nice option to have in the flex. And right now I think there's a really strong buy low window on Deebo Samuel. So take advantage of that while you guys still can. All right, next up is J.K. Dobbins of the LA Chargers, and I really like going out and buying low on Dobbins right now. Weird game script in week 7 against the Cardinals, 9.6 fantasy points, and I do have some concerns about the Chargers offense right now and what they're really going to be, although I've had concerns all season long, and in an interesting way, they were able to throw the football actually pretty effectively this past week, and their running game wasn't as good. They also just couldn't score any touchdowns, and the Cardinals defense came to play. I don't know if I want to read too much into this one, but it was a good matchup in week 7 for Dobbins, who had just 40 yards on the ground and added 3 catches for 26 receiving yards, and like I said, 9.6 fantasy points. But for the most part, I still really like Dobbins. This is a run-first offense. He's a top 20 fantasy football running back, averaging 14.7 fantasy points per game. And this week, he gets the Saints, okay? We're starting to want to start whatever running back is playing the Saints on a regular basis is the way things are looking. This defense just got completely gashed by Javonte Williams in week 7. The week before that, Bucky Irving, Sean Tucker ran all over that defense. So I like J.K. Dobbins a lot. There's a home game for the Chargers this week. I think he's going to bounce back in nice fashion. I think if you own J.K. Dobbins, should be starting him. But if you're able to go out and trade for J.K. Dobbins with a down week in week 7, the offense struggling against the Cardinals, not being able to score, this team just kind of in a weird spot. The defense didn't play great. They should bounce back nicely against the Saints this week, especially if Spencer Rattler is the starting quarterback for the Saints. And overall, J.K. Dobbins should bounce back as this is a smash matchup. And I still think Dobbins is the heartbeat of this offense, a run-first offense under Jim Harbaugh. They're going to utilize Dobbins plenty as the season goes on. So take advantage of this buy low window. Get Dobbins on your roster. He is a smash play in week 8. And last but not least, we got my guy Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. Not the greatest matchup here against the Cincinnati Bengals in week 8, but this should be a good game script. We should get points out of both teams. We got Jalen Hurts, Joe Burrow in Cincinnati. This is the type of game where the Bengals are going to be looking to apply defensive pressure to A.J. Brown. And that, of course, should open up things for Devonta Smith. This Bengals run defense not very good, so Saquon should be able to help things out here. And overall, Devonta Smith, I get it. 0.8 fantasy points in week 7, but this is part of the Devonta Smith experience. I've been a Devonta Smith fan in fantasy football since his rookie season. I've owned plenty of Devonta Smith over the past couple seasons, and let's take away his rookie season because that had more volatility and that's expected. But you go back to 2022, 0 points in week 1 against the Lions. You go back to last year, 1.6 points in week 5. This is just the goose egg game that Devonta Smith has given us in 2024. I think he will be perfectly fine, and I think he's still a great player to own in fantasy football. If there's a buy low window on Devonta Smith, take advantage of it. He's got some really good matchups coming up. The Jaguars in week 9, the Cowboys, the Commanders, the Rams, the Ravens, the Panthers, the Commanders in week 16, the Cowboys in week 17. They have a week 15 matchup against the Steelers. But outside of that, this is a really soft schedule overall and in fantasy football for the Philadelphia Eagles coming up. Devonta Smith still averaging 13.4 fantasy points per game. Still a stud, consistent guy that you can trust. He's been a little bit banged up. Got back into things in week 6 with 15.4 fantasy points. The dud last week. Outside of that, every start, double digits in every single game so far in the season. He will be fine. Take advantage of this buy low window because I don't think it's going to last very long. And that'll do it for today's video. There are 8 players I think you guys should go out and buy low on while you still can. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below if you guys need anything whatsoever. Moving into week 8 of the season, drop me a comment. I'll answer every single comment on this video before Sunday's slate of games roll around. And don't forget, guys, we have everything that you could possibly need for week 8 of fantasy football here on the channel. Make sure you guys go check out the videos, but more importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.